Greetings. My name is Jeff Smith, minister for the Haymarket Church of Christ, and this is our continuing uh, study of Genesis, the story of Genesis. This is the 11th out of 13 lessons intended for June 17th, 2020. This is the first lesson on Joseph, Genesis chapters 37 through 41. We've already covered all of the book of Genesis up until this point. We started, of course, with the creation, then the world before the flood itself, the world after the flood. And at that point, we pick up the study of the patriarchs, Abraham, 3 lessons on him. We had 1 lesson on Isaac, 2 lessons on Jacob, and now we're starting into what will be the last 3 lessons for this course. Joseph, 3 parts on Joseph. This is lesson 11, Joseph part 1. I've invited you to pay close attention to the word Toledah in the Hebrew, which is usually translated, these are the generations of. Those are the natural breaks in the telling of this creation and beginning account. And as we move into our this section that we're beginning with the life of Joseph, we're in the last one of these generations of, and this is referred to in Genesis 37 verse 2 as the generations of Jacob, but we spend a lot of time talking about his son, and we learn, of course, about Jacob from studying his son, but this is the last one of these natural divisions of the book of Genesis. As Genesis chapter 37 opens, we see Jacob living in the land of his father's sojournings, which is the land of Canaan. And then that phrase that we were just talking about, these are the generations of Jacob. And immediately we go to Joseph, and we understand he's 17 years old. He was a keeper of sheep with his brothers. We see as he was raised with the children of Bilhah and Zilpah, which are Dan and Naphtali and Gad and Asher. And that at one point, I don't know why the scriptures relate this, but they say that he bore a report to his father about them, which was not a good report. Verse 3, it says that Joseph was the favorite of Jacob because he was the son of or Israel. He was the son of Israel's old age. And to identify that, Israel presents Joseph with a coat, a robe of many colors. And I don't know what he was thinking to show this kind of favoritism, but he does, and that becomes a wedge between Joseph and his brothers. And it says in verse 4, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. So this is not a good beginning. This is not a good family dynamic that is set up here. You don't normally think about brothers hating a brother, but that's what happens. And it seems like the situation is only aggravated by not only the dreams that Joseph receives, but then his relating of those dreams. And the first dream involves a sheaf, Joseph's sheaf, and all the brothers have sheaves. And the brothers' sheaves are bowing down to him. And he tells them about this, and they don't like the idea. Then he has another dream where the sun, the moon, and the stars are bowing down to him. And he understands that this is including not only his brothers bowing down, but his parents bowing down to him as well. And this enrages the brothers and surprises his father. In verse 10, what is this dream that you've dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow down ourselves to the ground before you? And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. So he has related these dreams, and I don't know that he was supposed to, but he did. And it doesn't help family relations at all. Perhaps the father has an open mind. It says that he kept the saying in his mind. He recalled it. But it seems like sharing these dreams bothered everybody. Well, the brothers have an opportunity, and they take advantage of it. I guess it was an opportunity to do a lot of different things. They chose to do a really terrible thing to their brother. Joseph is sent to go and by his father to go help his brothers, to see how the brothers are doing, see if it is well with them, and then bring word back in verse 14. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And he has to search until he finds him. The map here shows the journey from Hebron to Shechem. And he finds the brothers, and this tells you, they're a long ways away from their father at this point. But they see him from afar off, verse 18, and they say, this is our chance to do something awful to him. It looks like initially they are going to kill him. It says that in verse 18. But Reuben intercedes, and in verse 22 says, don't shed any blood. Let's just throw him into this empty pit here. And he's thinking, in the latter part of verse 22, that he'll have an opportunity to come back and rescue him out of the pit, and he will have saved Joseph from any terrible thing happening to him. So the alternative that Reuben proposes, to throw him into the pit, is done after they take his coat off of him. It seems like Reuben then is called away at this point, and then some slave traders come by, and Judah says to his brothers in verse 26, there's no profit for us if we kill him and bury him. Why don't we sell him? And it's interesting that he says, for he is our brother, in verse 27. Yeah, he's our brother after all. Yeah, well, he's your brother, so don't sell him into slavery even. But no, he's our brother, so we'll just sell him into slavery. We won't kill him. You can just see how twisted their thinking is and how evil this whole plan is. And so the Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit, and they sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt. And so when Reuben returns in verse 29 and sees that Joseph's not there, he's just distraught. And, what am I going to do? How am I going to explain this to Dad? And so the extension of this, the cover-up, if you will, in verse 31, they took Joseph's robe, that special robe that had many colors, that was uniquely Joseph's, and slaughtered a goat and put that goat blood all over the coat, and then presented this to their father and said, hey, we found this. Do you recognize it? And of course he recognizes it. It's the one he had given to Joseph. And so he follows the suggestion that they presented, that Joseph had been devoured by a fierce animal and was no more. So think of the hardship and the emotional duress that they put their father to by doing this. This is so evil. This whole deed is so evil. And I focus also on Joseph, on that long trip from Dothan down to Egypt, thinking all the while, well, when Dad hears about this, he'll come and get me. He'll come and save me because I'm his favorite. Not knowing that the brothers have lied to Israel and made it so he wouldn't even bother looking because he assumes that he's dead. And so the bitterness towards the brethren is understandable in the mind of Joseph, would probably spread to his father as well. Dad didn't care enough to come and get me. And just how desperate, how terrible you'd feel, not only a slave, but being abandoned so by your family. I think that's an important thing to understand as we study the life of Joseph. Most of this last quarter of the book of Genesis is about Joseph, but we've got this instance, this one chapter devoted to Judah's family that is of real interest, and probably put in there because this is the tribe from which ultimately the Lord will come. And so maybe we need to know a little bit more about this particular brother. But what we see in chapter 38 is, well, it's disturbing. It's disturbing for the sexual sins that we see here. Folks are all mixed up on sexuality and how to properly exercise that sexuality in a family. And we see a lot of sin in this section. But we follow Judah leaving his brethren. We don't know exactly why, taking up with an Adullamite whose name was Hira, and then coming to find a wife whose name was Shua, and having 3 sons, or Bathshua, having 3 sons by her, Onan, and Shelah. And then one of them, the oldest, takes a wife. So this is Genesis 38, verse 6. Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Now we don't know exactly what he did that was wicked, but it is this general pronouncement: he was wicked. And we see that the Lord, some translations say he let him die, and others say that he put him to death. And so the consequences of our wickedness here, Er's wickedness, is his death. Well, that leaves Tamar, his widow, childless. And years later, in the law of Moses, as we see in Deuteronomy 25, verse 5, there's this idea of levirate marriage. And it says, if brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go in to her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her, which would be to raise up children and have those children stay part of the family, maybe even part of the inheritance going to them. So that's the plan that is formalized in the law of Moses years later, but it seems like it's in effect here as well. It's the custom even back in these later years of the book of Genesis. And so Judah says to Onan in verse 8, go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her. So now we see Onan and Tamar married, or performing the levirate marriage for his departed brother but Onan is not ready to comply with what is supposed to happen here, raising up children for his departed brother, but he wants to enjoy all the benefits of the relationship. And so you can read verses 6 through 11 and see that. And I think, young men especially need to do that. I'll not go through all the details here, but see what Onan did was wicked also, as whatever had done was wicked. And so God kills him as well. And so 2 brothers being put to death for their wickedness. It bespeaks awful things about Judah's family, that there would be this much wickedness, and the kind of wickedness that God immediately answers with putting the offender to death. But this levirate marriage didn't work out well for Tamar, and she's still childless. Well, there's one more brother, Shelah, and he's young at this point, at least in Judah's estimation. And so Judah invites Tamar to stay in the house, and when Shelah is old enough, then he'll go ahead and will do this levirate marriage for the 3rd time. And so she's content to bide her time, but in the process of time, Shelah got plenty old enough, and Judah did not give Tamar to him in marriage. And for whatever reason, she's just kind of in the household and not married to anybody, and nothing's developing as it should. So his wife, Bathsheba, Judah's wife, passes away, and Tamar sees her opportunity. And so she goes, she knows where he's traveling, and she goes along the way and disguises herself as a prostitute. And he goes into her, and she bargains for his artifacts that he's got specific to him to hold until they can bring the animal, which was going to be the price for the service rendered here, back to her. And so he goes into her and goes on his way. He arranges for the animal to be sent back to her, a young goat from the flock. But when it's sent back to her, of course, she has packed up her station there and gone back to the house, and nobody can find her, and they don't know what's happened to her until later, when in verse 24, 3 months later, Judah was told, Tamar, your daughter has been immoral. She's pregnant by her immorality, and that's when there's a confrontation. Well, Judah says, bring her out and let her be burned. This is verse 24. And as she's being brought out, she sent to her father-in-law, and she says, by the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant. She said, please identify who these are, the signet and the cord and the staff. And those are the things that she had taken in pledge as the prostitute when she disguised herself as a prostitute. And so Judah identified them. Now, those are mine. And then he says, she is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah. And he did not know her again. So in effect, he wound up performing the duty of a brother-in-law as the father-in-law. But he didn't keep her as a wife. He did not know her again. But she goes ahead and has twins, and an unusual instance in their birth. A hand emerged initially, and they put a little string around it, a scarlet thread around that hand, but it was withdrawn, and then the other brother came out first. And so the names of the boys are Zerah and Perez. And so a sordid tale about Judah's family and the birth of these two boys, how that came to be. We resume our focus on Joseph in chapter 39. He had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. And so in Potiphar's house, Joseph is a most faithful servant. Joseph found favor in Potiphar's sight, and Potiphar made him overseer of the house, put him in charge of all he had. And God was blessing Joseph's work, the way he did it and what he did. And Joseph becomes second to Potiphar in the house. And he didn't worry about anything that Joseph was in charge of. Now it says that Joseph was handsome in form and appearance in the latter part of verse 6. And so Potiphar's wife casts her eyes on Joseph and says, lie with me. But he refused, and he said to his master's wife, behold, and this is a great rationale here. When you're contemplating sin, think like this. Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house. He has put everything that he has in my charge, and so he's trusting me. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How can I then do this great wickedness and sin against God? Some folks would say these are two consenting adults and they can do as they will. Joseph recognized the sanctity of marriage and says, no, that's not right. I will not do that thing. And so he has a great mindset here. He's got his head on straight about how marriage should be respected and that he shouldn't have any relations with her. But she does not give up the idea. And so one day he was in the house to do his work. None of the men in the house were there, and she caught him by his garment saying, "Lie with me." But he just, in the New Testament, tells us to flee fornication, to run from it. And he did. But she grabbed his garment and kept a hold of it. And of course, this lust that she had seems like affection, but it can quickly become hate as well. And so she uses that garment to she offers it as proof that actually he was the one that tried to advance upon her. Of course, this charge is made to Potiphar, and Potiphar then sends Joseph off to prison for trying to lie with his wife. But of course, that was a lie. It was an untruth. Well, in prison, it goes pretty much the same as it went in Potiphar's house in terms of faithfulness and service. Joseph does so well in the prison that he rises to number 2, to the warden, if you will. As Joseph is exercising his duties in the prison and had, I guess, freedom, he was attending to the cupbearer and the baker of the king who had been imprisoned there. And they have their dreams. They had received some dreams that they thought were important, but that they couldn't understand. And Joseph came to them in the morning. This is chapter 40, verse 6. He saw that they were troubled, so he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in the custody of the master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" And they said to him, "We've had dreams, and there's no one to interpret them." And Joseph says, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." And the implication is Joseph has the relationship with God. God is the ultimate dream interpreter, and so he can get the interpretation of the dreams for them. And we initially talked about Joseph being the dreamer, being on that side, the recipient of dreams. Now he's the dream interpreter. And so the chief cupbearer, verse 9, told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened to grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. I took the grapes, pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." And Joseph said to him, "This is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days, and in 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly, when you were his cupbearer." So you're going to get restored back to where you were before. And then he says, by the way, verse 14, when you get back there in that position of authority again, remember that I'm here in prison and get me out of here. And I haven't done anything wrong, and I shouldn't be in prison here. And so there's an implied agreement here. Well, in verse 16, the other fellow, now the baker, liked the interpretation of the cupbearer, so he relates his dream. "There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head." And Joseph answered and said, "Well, this is its interpretation. 3 baskets are 3 days, and in 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat flesh from you." Yikes. Not a very happy interpretation, but the accurate interpretation, evidently. And so it worked out that 3 days later, everything came to pass just as Joseph had interpreted the dreams to say. And so the cupbearer was restored to his position, but the baker was hanged. And even though they had this agreement, Joseph and the cupbearer didn't say anything about Joseph, and he stayed in the prison. Well, excuse me, I got a little ahead of my slides there, but this Joseph is the dream interpreter for the prisoners, and now he's going to be the dream interpreter for Pharaoh. Pharaoh has a dream, and it involves a number of cows. He relates that dream, and he awoke and then fell asleep and dreamed the dream a second time. And so it was repeated. And I guess we should talk about it. Here's the dream that he had. He was standing by the Nile. Behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile, and the ugly, thin cows ate up the 7 attractive, plump cows. And so there's the dream. And it is repeated, as we said. This time it was with ears of grain, and then thin ears of grain after that. And so in verse 8, after these 2 dreams, Pharaoh's spirit was troubled when he awoke, and he sent and he called for all the magicians of Egypt. That would be their wise men, the cabinet, the trusted people that you keep around to help you with difficult problems. He calls for them, and he told them their dreams. Nobody could figure it out, though. And this is when the cupbearer, who had been in prison and then restored, has an aha moment and said, well, I know I'm my bad. We'd say my bad. In verse 9, I remember my offenses today. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, we dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office. The baker was hanged. The implication is this guy helped us with our dream interpretations. He can help you, Pharaoh, interpret your dream. So Pharaoh, in verse 14, sent and called Joseph. They quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself, changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, behold, in my dream, and he relates these dreams to him. And Joseph explained to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. As I told Pharaoh, God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, but after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dreams means that the thing is fixed by God. God will shortly bring it about. Now, therefore, so that's the interpretation of the dream, and Joseph hasn't been asked for a solution, but he goes ahead and offers the solution. Now, therefore, in verse 33, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. All right, so in these great years of plenty, we're going to take 1/5 of the harvest and we're going to set it aside in storage. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. And so there's his interpretation of the dream and a solution for how to deal with this famine that is approaching. Well, not only was Joseph the only one that could interpret this dream, he's the only one that had a plan for how to deal with it. And Pharaoh's just amazed. In verse 38, Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God?" So Pharaoh seems to understand that it wasn't just Joseph, but God through Joseph that is blessing him with this understanding, not only for what the dreams meant, but for what to do as well. And so he exalts him, he lifts him up to be the number 2 in Egypt. And so Joseph he gets in verse 42, Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand, put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in fine garments, and put a gold chain around his neck. He made him ride in his 2nd chariot, and he called out before him, "Bow the knee." Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphenath-Paneah, and he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, of priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Now we get some timing here. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Remember, he was 17 when he went to visit his brothers. So 13 years have elapsed. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years that the earth produced abundantly, he gathered up all the food of these 7 years, and he stored it up. He put in every city the food from the fields around it. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. Now, before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, the priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, "God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house." So you can tell, as we referred to before, thinking about what it would have been like for Joseph to be taken into slavery and not rescued, that was a terrible memory for him. And all those years in prison and in Potiphar's house, he would have had to carry that memory. But now, as he's had a son, he says, "I've been able to put that behind me." In verse 52, the name of the second he called Ephraim, "For God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction." So even though he is in Egypt and afflicted there, Potiphar's house and in prison, he now has prospered and he's been fruitful. In verse 53, the 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph has said. There was famine in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. And when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread, and Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. What he says to you, do." So, when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, because famine was severe over all the earth. So from the storehouses that Joseph has amassed, he's now selling to everybody who's affected by the famine. That's how chapter 41 draws to a close. All right, that's the first of 3 parts of our study on Joseph. I invite you to come and join us at the building June 24th. We'll be studying the 12th lesson in this series of 13 on Joseph. The second part, it'll be chapters 42 through 45. God bless you.